All right, today we're going to take a look at the beginning of Chapter 8, which is how we went from a confederation to a constitution. And essentially what this chapter does is it takes a look at the Articles of Confederation, some major issues that were faced by the delegates to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and then the debate over ratifying the Constitution. So basically Chapter 8 is a giant question of now what do we do after winning the Revolutionary War. So Section 1 today deals with the Confederation Era. And this guy right here, his name is Daniel Boone. He plays an important role. In 1775, Daniel Boone and 30 woodsmen cut a road over the Appalachian Mountains into Kentucky. They hacked through brush, chopped down trees, they bridged creeks. They labored like this for about 250 miles, and eventually they arrived in a grassy meadow along the banks of the Kentucky River. Felix Walker, a member of Boone's party, described what they saw. He says, quote, "On entering the plain, we were permitted to view a very interesting and romantic sight. A number of buffaloes, supposed to be between 200 and 300, made off in every direction. Such a sight some of us never saw before, nor perhaps may ever again." And that's from Felix Walker's book, The Life and Adventures of Daniel Boone. Boone was one of the earliest American settlers in Kentucky. In the late 1700s, most Americans thought of Kentucky as the wild frontier. Some, like Boone, looked at the frontier and saw a world of opportunity. Exploring and governing these lands was only one of the many challenges that faced the new government of the United States. So today, by the end of this, you should be able to describe the expansion of the nation and the development of state governments. You will be able to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. You can evaluate the importance of the Northwest Ordinance, and you can also identify the causes and effects of Shays' Rebellion. So, moving on. Now, the trail into Kentucky that Daniel Boone helped build was known as the Wilderness Road. This road was not very easy to travel. It was too narrow for carts or wagons, but it became the main road into Kentucky. The settlers came on foot or on horseback, and settlers were drawn to Kentucky's rich river valleys where few Native Americans lived, but we did have some Native Americans like the Shawnee that lived, hunted, and fished in the area. And right here you can see the orange line from Black House, Tennessee, and you can see right here it stops in Cumberland Gap and then moves its way up into Kentucky. So that's the Wilderness Road right there. Now, tensions between Native Americans and settlers led to violent confrontations, but the settlers did not stop coming because land was so good. By the early 1790s, about 100,000 Americans lived in Kentucky. While settlers headed into the western territories, the people in the east began to create new state governments. Once the American colonies declared independence, each of the states set out to create its own government. The framers or creators of the state constitutions did not want to destroy the political systems that they had had as colonies. They simply wanted to make those systems more democratic. Some states experimented with creating separate branches of government, giving different powers to different branches. By creating separate branches, Americans had hoped to prevent the government from becoming too powerful. And that's where we get our example here on the right of today's separation of our branches, our legislative, executive, and judicial. Some states included a Bill of Rights in their constitutions as a way to keep the government under control. The idea of a Bill of Rights came from the English Bill of Rights of 1689. This was a list of rights that the government guaranteed to English citizens. Although not all the states had a Bill of Rights, all of them did have a republican form of government. In a republic, the people choose representatives to govern them. For example, Scott Walker, our governor, or Barack Obama, our president. We elect them to make decisions for us. If we don't like the decisions they make, we re-elect them. If they do a job that we deem worthy, if they don't do a good job, we don't re-elect them. If they do a good job that we like, we do re-elect them, within their term limits, of course. While the states were setting up their governments, Americans also discussed the form of their national government. During the Revolutionary War, Americans realized that they needed to unite to win the war against Britain. As Silas Deane, a diplomat from Connecticut, wrote, "United we stand, divided we fall." In 1776, the Continental Congress began to develop a plan for a national government. They agreed that the government should be a republic, but the delegates disagreed about whether each state should have one vote or voting should be based on population. They also disagreed about whether the national government or the individual states should control the lands west of the Appalachians. The Continental Congress finally arrived at a final plan called the Articles of Confederation. In the Articles, the national government had few powers because many Americans were afraid that a strong government would lead to tyranny or oppressive rule. The national government was run by a Confederation Congress. Each state had only one vote, and the national government held the power to wage war, make peace, sign treaties, and issue money. But the Articles left most important powers to the states. These powers included the authority to set taxes and enforce national laws. The Articles proposed to leave the states in control of the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Continental Congress passed the Articles in November of 1777. It then sent the Articles to the states for ratification or approval. By July 1778, 8 states had ratified the Articles, but some of the small states that did not have western land claims refused to sign. These states felt that unless the western lands were placed under the control of the national government, they would be at a disadvantage. The states with western lands could sell them to pay off debts left from the Revolution, but states without lands would have difficulty paying off these high war debts. So over the next 3 years, all the states gave up their claims to western lands, and this led to small states ratifying the Articles. In 1781, Maryland became the 13th state to accept the Articles, and as a result, the United States finally had an official government. Sorry, I missed a slide here, but so once again, the smaller states thought they were at a disadvantage because the large states could sell that western land and pay off their war debts. So it took a couple of years until 1781 to ratify, all 13 states to ratify the Articles of Confederation. One of the most important questions that the Confederation Congress faced was what to do with the western lands that it now controlled. Congress passed important laws on how to divide and govern these lands, which is the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Land Ordinance of 1785 called for surveyors to stake out 6-mile square plots called townships in the western lands. These lands later became known as the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Territory included land that formed the states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. So this is why we get our townships, and most of our blocks out in the country are exact square miles. We get the town of Basha, Beaverbrook, Baronet, any of the townships that we live in. That's how we got our townships. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 described how the Northwest Territory was to be governed. As the territory grew in population, it would gain rights to self-government. When there were 5,000 free males in an area, men who owned at least 50 acres of land could elect an assembly. When there were 60,000 people, they could apply to become a new state. The Northwest Ordinance also set conditions for settlement in the Northwest Territory and outlined the settlers' rights, such as slavery was outlawed, the rivers were to be open to navigation by all, and freedom of religion and trial by jury were guaranteed. Now, this was really nice for the United States because the Northwest Ordinance set a pattern for orderly growth. As the nation grew, it followed this pattern, and the territories added after the Northwest Territory. Now, aside from its handling of land issues, however, the Confederation Congress had few successes. By the end of the Revolutionary War, the United States faced serious problems, and the Confederation Congress did not have enough power to solve them. Debt was a serious problem for the government. Congress had borrowed large sums to pay for the Revolutionary War. Much of that money was owed to soldiers of its own army. Upset at not being paid, several hundred soldiers surrounded the Pennsylvania State House, where Congress was meeting in June of 1783. The soldiers threatened the legislators, thrusting their bayonets through the windows. The delegates were forced to flee the city. The event was a clear sign of Congress's weakness. Even if Congress wanted to pay the soldiers, they didn't have the right to levy taxes. The national government depended on the states to send money to Congress, but the states sent very little money. Congress was not alone in facing economic crises. People throughout the nation faced very hard times, and in Massachusetts in particular, the economy was so bad that people rose up in arms against the government. In the mid-1780s, Massachusetts faced economic problems, as did other states. People had very little money, but the state continued to levy very high taxes. The average family owed $200 in taxes per year, which was more money than most farmers made. So a lot of Massachusetts farmers fell very deep into debt. Debt laws at the time were also very strict. Anyone who could not repay his debts would have his property auctioned off. If the auction didn't raise enough money to settle the debts, the debtor could be put in jail. In western Massachusetts, many jails were packed with debtors. So farmers asked the Massachusetts legislature to provide debt relief, but the legislature refused and the farmers rebelled. One of the leaders of the rebellion was a Revolutionary War veteran named Daniel Shays. he commanded a group of about 1,500 men. So in January of 1787, Shays and his men marched on a federal arsenal where we store weapons. The arsenal was defended by 900 soldiers from the state militia. The militia quickly defeated Shays' men, but even though the militia put down what is known as Shays' Rebellion, the farmers won the sympathy of many people, and America's leaders realized that an armed uprising of common farmers was a big danger and red flag for the future. Some leaders hoped that the nation's ills could be solved by strengthening the national government, so in the next section we'll read how Americans held a convention to change the Articles of Confederation.